Oh, you can watch it.
I barely understand some of those really heavy full chapters. Put that on top of that.
Yeah, and I really think it's like the root thing. You have all the word in French, all those like 3 letters. You can trace it back.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak, Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's meeting, which is another in our ongoing series on terrorism and homeland security issues co-sponsored with the RAND Corporation and the U.S. Army's Eisenhower National Security Series. The co-chair of this series, Bruce Hoffman, is traveling out of the country and sends his regrets, particularly since today's speaker is one of his colleagues at the RAND Corporation, Kim Cragin. Let me just, before introducing Kim and today's topic, let me mention upcoming events. In May, we will have 2 events. On May 15th, a Monday, in this room at noon, Mia Bloom, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Cincinnati, will speak on the increasing radicalization of European Muslims. That's Monday, May 15th, noon to 1:30. On May 17th, at between 10 and 11 a.m., Fran Townsend, the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, will speak in one of Lee Hamilton's Director Forum meetings, which will be co-sponsored with this series. And that's 10 to 11 on May 17th. The topic of her speech has not been determined yet or passed to us yet, but the time and place and speaker are confirmed. May 17th, 10 to 11 with Fran Townsend. Our topic could not be more timely: Hamas, past, present, and future. We're fortunate to have with us today one of the country's leading experts on this issue. Kim Cragin is an international policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. Since joining RAND in September 2000, she has focused on issues concerning the history of political violence. Her RAND publications include Terrorism and Development, Arms Trafficking in Colombia, The Dynamic Terrorist Threat, and Dissuading Terror. Kim has managed the RAND terrorism chronology since April 2001. In addition to her work for RAND, she's conducted research at Cambridge University's Faculty of History, where she's completing her doctoral dissertation. That research traces the transformation of Hamas in Palestinian society beginning in 1973, with its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, through the January 2006 elections. Kim has conducted field work in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, Colombia, United Kingdom, China, and Asia. So we're very pleased that Kim Cragin could join us today as a speaker in this series to discuss the issue of Hamas. So, Kim, floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It's always a little bit intimidating to be introduced as one of the country's leading experts on anything, I have to say. That's particularly the case when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When Bruce first asked me to give this talk, I hesitated a little bit because I find in speaking with to a public forum on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it's a highly emotional topic for most people. Whether you be Jewish or Muslim or Christian, for some reason it evokes a lot of emotion in people. For me, I first started studying Hamas in 1996. I was living in Jerusalem at the time when Hamas started what most people, until the recent Al-Aqsa Intifada, consider the series of most detrimental suicide bombings in Jerusalem. The number 18 bus, the morning, each Monday, 3 subsequent Monday mornings in a row, which was the bus that I rode to school in the morning. So that was my first introduction to the group. At the same time, I have spent a lot of time as a part of my field research in the Gaza refugee camps, as well as some in the West Bank. And I think that I'd like to think that having both experiences at least allows me to maintain somewhat of a balance in my analysis, but I'll leave that to you guys as the part of this talk. Of course, why are you here? You're basically here today because you're interested in this topic because of Hamas's victory in the January elections. Just as a bit of a background, I'm not sure how closely you guys have followed it, but Hamas won 74 out of the 132 seats in the Palestinian legislature, plus an additional 4. They sponsored 4 independent candidates, so they could be considered part of the Hamas party. So now we have a democratically elected ruling party who is also on the U.S. list of designated terrorist organizations, and it poses a bit of a problem for the United States government. Similarly, a key partner in the Middle East peace process has not recognized Israel's right to exist, which is another problem. And Hamas is actually the first Islamic party, depending on how you interpret that, democratically elected, that's been allowed to take power. Of course, in Algeria, they weren't allowed to take power there. And at the same time, and although that's changing somewhat, I think it's fair to say that Israeli political leadership has still been struggling to recover from Ariel Sharon's stroke. So you have a bit of a turmoil. That's the situation in the country. Just to provide you with a little bit of background, this dissertation research is based on my dissertation research. Mostly even at RAND, I focused on the relationship between the terrorist group and the local support community that the terrorist group is trying to get credibility from. That's what I focus on. This is what my dissertation research looked at, but I'm not going to be talking about my dissertation research. I just wanted to provide you with a little bit of context where I'm coming from. What I'm going to be doing is looking at 3 different questions. The first one, how can we understand Hamas's ideology, especially in a global war on terrorism when a lot of emphasis is on al-Qaeda? How can we understand Hamas in that context? What are the sources of Hamas's credibility in Palestinian society? How has that developed and grown over the past 30 years to the point that they won the elections? And what are the wider implications for Hamas's win, especially for the United States? I think it's important to note from the get-go when we're talking about Hamas's ideology that it's not a traditional Islamist group. This is the term that some political scientists and terrorism experts frequently throw around, and it generally means a militant organization that wants to implement Sharia law domestically and is willing to use violence to do so. Recently, it's also had another connotation, and that is it's part of the wider Khalifa movement. It's trying to institute a caliphate in the broader Muslim community. While Hamas might meet the first 2 requirements of an Islamist organization, it does not meet the third. It's not interested in establishing a wider caliphate in places like Saudi Arabia, in places like Indonesia. It's primarily focused on Palestine. And that's because statehood is too important. And you see this a lot in their rhetoric recently. Okay, just to provide some background, this is a key timeline of Hamas. So 1973, you have Sheikh Yassin. He establishes Al-Mujama al-Islami, which is this charitable organization which is sort of the precursor to Hamas. It's registered with the Israeli military as a charitable group in 1978. So when you hear people say sometimes, oh, the Israeli government sponsored Hamas, allowed Hamas to evolve, this is what they're referring to, but it's not the same like we would think of it today. 1987, the advent of the First Intifada. This is a key point for Hamas's development because Fatah and Arafat support Saddam Hussein. And so the rest of the Arab community gets really mad at Fatah, and Hamas strategically comes out and rebukes Saddam Hussein for his invasion of Kuwait. So it's a key point. 1994, I'm going to talk about the deportation, but it's another important point in the evolution of Hamas. Finally, in 1997, I just wanted to point out that the Israeli government tries to assassinate Khaled Mashal. So he's the key spokesman that you see out there talking a lot, and they botch it. Their agents get arrested in Jordan. And Jordan negotiates Sheikh Yassin's release from prison as a result of that. So this is important when you're looking at the dynamics between the Israeli government and Khaled Mashal in particular. And then finally, the elections. Okay, so let's talk about Hamas's ideology. As I was saying, what do I mean when it's not necessarily Islamist? So you have this interesting phenomenon. Hamas's leaderships come out of this, what some Arab scholars call a revivalist Islam movement, which takes place in the 1960s and 1970s, fundamentally in Egypt. Basically, what they're doing is it is a movement that is a rejection of nationalism. Nationalism isn't working, and so we need to, instead of identifying as Egyptian, instead of identifying as Saudi, we're going to identify as Muslim. And so it's actually a rejection of nationalism. And this is part of the history of the Muslim Brotherhood and the history that Hamas's leaders came out of. When you see them reciting people like Ibn Taymiyyah, this is the 13th century philosopher, 13th, 14th century philosopher, who makes the very first argument that man cannot live with both a political leadership and a religious leadership. It's too confusing. So you need to just have one leadership, and it should be religious. That's sort of what this revivalist Islam movement, that's the thinker that they frequently refer back to. So it's completely in juxtaposition with the nationalist component of Hamas. So these same leaders also come out of the Gaza refugee camps, a lot of them, where most Palestinian scholars say that Palestinian nationalism was solidified. You don't have a national identity in the Palestinian community until after the 1967 war, for the most part. This starts in the refugee camps, and a lot of the reason that you see in the charter, in the initial language of Hamas's charter, which was issued in 1988, has this nationalistic tone. So this tension is important in understanding the group. And actually, you can see it in a lot of different ways. So again, most people, when they talk about the charter, they talk about the anti-Semitism, and I don't want to play that down. It's definitely the case. But you see this interesting dialogue where they're not talking to Israelis, they're talking to other Palestinians, and they're putting themselves out there in contrast to the traditional Muslim Brotherhood or in contrast to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad by statements like this, by saying, look, nationalism is part and parcel of our religious identity. We're both nationalistic and we're religious. This is a picture of Sheikh Yassin. It's a nice example of this, where you have him, but with instead of the traditional headscarf, you have him wearing the Palestinian flag. And I think it's a nice illustration of that. Importantly, you also see this tension in Hamas's behavior. So, for example, everybody knows that Hamas's leaders have always been very, very critical of the corruption in Fatah and in the Palestinian Authority. But I think a lot of people fail to mention the fact that in 1994, there actually was an attempted coup. What had happened is a number of Hamas members had been put in prison by the Palestinian Authority, and there were a lot of riots against the Palestinian Authority. And it's Hamas leaders that calmed down the riots and say, no, we don't want a civil war within the Palestinian community. We're not going to counter the Palestinian Authority militarily. If we win, we're going to win through credible elections. So you see this tension in their behavior as well. So there are a couple explanations for this, or possible explanations. One is Hamas's leaders could actually truly believe both in Islamism and nationalism within their own society. Or it's possible, and I think this is perhaps a little bit more likely, that Hamas's legitimacy isn't necessarily based on its ideology. It's really based more on its activities, and so it's sort of towing this line as closely as it possibly can. It doesn't want to go quite too far. So what are the sources of Hamas credibility? I mentioned this, but it's basically coming from its terrorist attacks against Israel and its ability to challenge Israel militarily. That's an important point of its credibility, as well as its charitable activities, which a lot of people talk about. And then recently, it's gained a lot of credibility, even prior to the recent national elections, in its municipal management. And in fact, if you talk to people, they say the cities that won Hamas leaders and that are run by Hamas, those are the ones where the street lights are up and running. Those are the ones where the sewer system is working. And so that funneled into their recent municipal victory. Just to talk a little bit about their charities. A lot of people focus on this. I think it's important to realize that every single Palestinian militant faction that has tried to gain credibility in the history of this conflict has relied upon charities. This is not a Hamas invention. Just to give you a little bit of background, after the occupation from 1967 to 1981, the Israeli government policy was actually quite clever, and it mirrored somewhat what we're doing in Iraq right now, or what we did in the first years of Iraq, in that they were trying to rebuild Palestinian society in a Western image. So they were trying to disband the tribal structure, institute local municipal elections. They would choose people to run for those elections. And in part of this, there was a debate in Israeli society about whether West Bank and Gaza would get integrated into Israel, so it would be like the Israeli Arabs that you see in places like Haifa, or whether it would be separate. And that's part of this debate that takes place especially in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In this context, the militant groups realized that they needed to fill this gap in civil society. They couldn't let the Israeli process do that themselves. So if tribal structure was going to start to deteriorate, they needed to step in and not let the Israeli system do that for them. And so they start to organize civil society groups and charitable organizations around this faction. And I think the concept is sort of steadfastness in the early years, as opposed to Israeli presence. And later, you start to get a more nationalistic building a state. But in the first time, it's just sort of direct aid in that sense. This poster is an example of this. So what you have here, it's actually a poster that I got from archives in Lebanon. And it's circa sort of 1974, 1975. And it's a PFLP. It's not an Islamist poster. But I think it's interesting because it's saying, I chose it in part because it's English, but it's saying, look, Palestinians, who has really cared about you for the past 22 years? And it has both at the bottom a key hijacking that the PFLP did in 1973, and then in the top it has pictures of its charitable activities in the West Bank and Gaza. So you can see, as they're talking to the Palestinian people, that this is something that's in the forefront of their mind as well. As I mentioned earlier, Hamas's leaders originally focused on religious reform and charity. That was the Al-Mujama al-Islami. What I have here on the top is a list of the individuals who are considered the founding members of Hamas. If you read some people, they will also choose Mahmoud Zahar, he's now the foreign minister, and Khaled Mashal as founding members. But actually, interviews of Hamas members themselves, they don't identify those two. They just identify these individuals as the founders. The ones with stars by them, in case you're wondering, are the ones that have been assassinated in Israeli policy. Until 1988, Al-Mujama basically focused on medical care, orphanages, mosques, and university scholarships in the West Bank. The cities that they focused on were Gaza, Hebron, Nablus, and Beerah. And these are important. They'll come up again in the elections. Hamas leaders now state that even in these early years, when you read interviews with them, they planned on using violent activity, but there's no real evidence of that. The first real evidence of it is in 1983 when Yassin and 12 others are arrested by the Israeli government for gun smuggling. And that seems to pretty much stop any visions of grandeur that they have towards violence until the Al-Aqsa Intifada. It's important to note that despite the fact that Hamas is trying to do charitable activity, it cannot compete with the PLO and Fatah. By this time, Fatah has convinced all the Arab nations to funnel any money that they have to give the Palestinians through them. So all of the Arab nations' charity is coming through Fatah. So Hamas really can't compete. So it really has to go for a military approach in order to get some legitimacy with the Palestinian people. They had a youth wing already prior to the Intifada, and so once the Intifada starts, this becomes what we now know as Al-Qassam, or the militant branch of Hamas. They said they had, most experts put the amount of people that are Hamas supporters in the late 1980s, about 2,000, with maybe about 100 to 150 as part of Al-Qassam in the youth wing. The Shura Council met shortly after the advent of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Yassin was in prison. So Dukhan, he chairs the Shura Council, and it's the same guys who started the group 15 years ago are the same ones who issue the Hamas charter. 15 years prior are the ones who issue the Hamas charter. So, what are the first terrorist attacks by Hamas? In 1988, Al-Qassam members kidnapped an Israeli soldier, and in 1990, they stabbed 3 more. And when you read interviews from Hamas leaders, they say these were huge attacks. And I think in retrospect, it's quite interesting that that's really all they could manage to do. Having said that, former Prime Minister Rabin responds to this very, very seriously, rounds up about 415 different people. Most of them are Hamas members, although some of them are Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and deports them. Deportations are not unusual, and in fact had been going on for a while. And actually they proved to be quite effective. Israel would deport people, they would live in Germany, in Spain, and they would never return, and they would never become militants again, and it was an effective policy. What Hamas did, though, is they didn't disperse. They stayed. They stayed in Marj al-Zahor, which was a camp in southern Lebanon, and took the opportunity to really solidify their strategy, to solidify their vision, and to solidify their leadership. So it was an important time for the Hamas members, and I want to show you something again with these leaders. So you see in the top list, these are the same founders, and the bottom list, the first dash, is a lot of the names that you consider leaders today, and the one as well as some of the ones before. And this is what happens basically. The ones that are now highlighted in black are part of the 415 people that get deported. So you can see the shift in sort of leadership in Hamas happens as part of that deportation. What's really interesting then, these bottom ones that I've just highlighted now, in 1995, they wanted to run for elections with the first series of elections when President Arafat was elected as part of the first legislative council. Hamas leadership said no. If you run, we will kick you out of the group. The first name, Al-Fallujah, he does run. He ends up being Arafat's chief spokesman for a while. The rest of them do not run. And they say, okay, we want to stay in Hamas. We don't want to run as part of the 1995 elections. But Palestinians generally consider them the more moderate component of Hamas because of this reason. The guys in pink are now the ones of this core leadership group who've recently been elected, which I find fascinating. You have Haniyeh, again, who wanted to run in 95 but was told no. Mahmoud Zahar, who's the Gaza leadership, who's considered one of the more radical members. He's now the prime minister. And then 2 of the people who sort of faded out in the 90s and then recently have come back. But it's also important to see who didn't run and therefore is not part of the election. Shama'a is interesting. He's the head of their social network and their charities. Wasn't on the ticket, not part of the council. I think Hamas strategically picked the people it wanted to run so that if it did fail, if it did implode, it still had enough credible leaders outside of the government that it could sustain itself. That's just my explanation. I'm not really sure. Okay, let's talk about its militancy a little bit. There's a little bit of a discussion about when Hamas first conducts its first suicide bombing. A lot of people say it takes place in 1993. Hamas leaders don't claim a suicide bombing until 1994. This is actually a little bit important. It's not just a historical discrepancy. But what you see here is a pattern of Hamas suicide bombings in gray as compared to the rest of the Palestinians in yellow. And actually, even though everybody associates suicide bombings with Hamas, the group that's associated for the spike, that's responsible for the spike in Al-Aqsa Intifada is the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, which is associated with Arafat's Fatah. Most people say the reason why that happened is they were competing for recruits with Hamas. So Hamas was seen as being very successful militarily because of its suicide bombings, so the other groups needed to adopt them so that people would come to them instead of going to Hamas. That's what most people seem to think. The reason why the 1993 suicide bombing is interesting, particularly to me, is because Hamas's leaders justify the advent of suicide bombings using the Hebron massacre, which takes place in February 1994. So what happens, they say, is that after Barak Goldstein murdered 29 Muslims in Hebron, which is the massacre at the mosque, then we started suicide bombings. So it's an interesting argument in that sense. In fact, they issue leaflets and statements, and these attacks, they do say after the first and second attacks it's retaliation for the Hebron massacre, and for the other ones it's retaliation for Israel's assassination of their people. If you look at the data, it substantiates this somewhat. So what I have here is a list of the things that they say it's retaliation for, and then the attacks themselves. So I would say for the first 3 or 4 years, it is actually a pretty close pattern. There's the Hebron massacre, then there's a suicide bombing. There's an assassination, then there's a suicide bombing. But around 96, 97, that stops, and you start to see a new pattern emerge. That new pattern, at least in Hamas's terms, is justified as part of military parity. And you see them say this a lot, and in fact the statement that was released by the Interior Minister that was justifying the Pidge attack also had echoes of this. So what they say basically is, look, we don't have F-16s, we don't have Apache helicopters, suicide bombings are the only military tool that we have, and so this is why we use them against Israeli civilians. So by the Al-Aqsa Intifada, you have Hamas's charities have expanded. Again, because of the Gulf War, a lot of that Arab nation money started flowing to Hamas as opposed to Fatah. And you have they've demonstrated that they are the best group to challenge Israel militarily. And so this is the credibility and the momentum that they use to help win the municipal elections in 2004, 2005. It's important to note at that same time in the Al-Aqsa Intifada, what's happening is the PA infrastructure is being attacked by Israel, and aid is not going to the Palestinian Authority as much as it used to. So basically, sort of in the last few years, if you needed food or health care, a lot of people went to Hamas because it was the only thing that was still left up and running because the PA infrastructure had been so demolished, both by the halting of foreign aid and by just, all-out war. Okay, so what happens at the municipal elections? You guys probably know this, but there are a series of 4 different municipal elections that take place in 2004, 2005. Hamas wins 34% of the municipal seats. So basically, honestly, this is what people thought would happen. People thought Fatah was going to take a strong majority. They thought Hamas would maybe bring in around 25, 26, not maybe as high as it did. And it was interesting to watch the Palestinian political commentators after the municipal elections, because what they said was, well, of course, when people are voting for municipal leaders, they're voting for things like charity. They're voting for things like sewage systems. But when they vote for the national leadership, they're going to vote for Fatah, because they're going to vote on broader, wider issues. So they actually thought that Hamas would have a stronger showing in the municipal elections than they would have in the national leadership. And this is sort of what you saw coming out of it. Just to point out 2 things, the 2 councils that Hamas won a complete majority on were Nablus, which you would expect, but also Al-Bira, which actually is fairly Christian to a certain extent, but it's been one of those cities that Hamas picked out in the 70s that it was going to try and work on for a long time. So you can see this sort of success. All right. Now the one that everybody's really interested in, which are the legislative elections. Palestinian elections are somewhat strange to me. They have a proportional list, so that's like it is in Israel, where you just vote for a particular party. And they have a geographic list, where they vote for people. They have both to combine to be part of the Legislative Council. This is the proportional list. So they win 29 out of 66 from the proportional list, so not a real majority. The people are Haniyeh, Zahar, Dokhan, the same names you've seen before. 5 out of the 29 from the proportional list are women, and I think that's a better percentage than we have in the United States. That's not necessarily a positive thing for Hamas, but you can maybe consider it as an indictment against our system. All right, just thought I'd point that out. They have a very strong showing in the geographical representation, so when you vote for a specific person. And this is where they really won their majority. They win 44 out of 66 out of the geographical representation. They take Hebron. They take northern Gaza. Fatah takes half of Bethlehem. These are the Christian candidates who run, as well as parts of Jericho. Only one woman on the Hamas ticket for this one. What are the wider implications? I think it's somewhat interesting that Hamas's win poses a dilemma both for the United States and for Al-Qaeda and the wider Salafi jihadi movement. And you see this going on right now. It's actually quite interesting. Al-Qaeda has actually openly criticized Hamas. I'm sure you guys have been following this. But in March, basically, when Hamas is arranging the meeting with the Russian government, the Chechens come out and say, hey, solidarity with your Muslim brothers, you don't really want to meet with the Russian government. And Hamas says, yeah, we're still going to meet with the Russian government if that's okay with you. And Zawahiri, the number 2 in Al-Qaeda, comes out in a speech that's broadcast over Al Jazeera and criticizes Hamas for doing this. I've seen a lot of back and forth between different people. There was an article in the Washington Post yesterday that was talking about Zawahiri's effort to try and embrace and get his arms around this wider movement. And they mentioned that Hamas hasn't actively debated and refuted Al-Qaeda, and that's true, but they have brushed them off a little bit. There was an interview afterwards that I was listening to where they asked him, what do you think about this? And his response was, well, Zawahiri is entitled to his own opinion. And that has been sort of the Hamas response. Just recently, a couple weeks ago, al-Libi, who's associated with the Yemen attack, issued a leaflet, and they're criticizing Hamas on both religious levels and secular political levels. So the first one is Hamas is participating in a legislative council. As you know, Salafi groups, even nonviolent ones, for example, Hizb ut-Tahrir has been known to issue statements about this issue where, how do I explain this? Allah is the only one who's allowed to make laws. So if you, as a good Muslim, participate in a legislative council, you are assuming the role of God when you're voting for laws. And so you're not really supposed to be participating in a legislative council. So this is what they're saying. This is the criticism that they're giving Hamas as part of this. Also the fact that they're elevating Palestinians above other Muslims like Chechens. Hamas is legitimizing the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. And then the last one, which is interesting, is because Arab nations can now support Hamas, you're legitimizing the tyranny of these Arab nations and you're giving them credibility. And these are the criticisms. What's interesting to me is, and I think you're seeing this, is people are a little bit worried about what Hamas is going to do in sort of this wider group. Because I think Hamas on the Muslim street has a lot of street credibility and is probably one of the ones globally that does have as much credibility as Al-Qaeda. And so I think that's why they're a little bit concerned about that. Okay. For Israel in particular, but also the region, a lot of militant groups are jockeying for influence in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Hezbollah continues to try and create a greater presence there. For the most part, Israeli security officials will say that Hamas, for the most part, is rebuking that to a certain extent, rebuffing that. Hijj and Al-Aqsa martyrs are the real ones that Hezbollah have been able to get an influence on. This is a Hamas poster. For those of you who are familiar with Hezbollah, this is the Hezbollah sign, the hand with the gun. So Hamas is has adopted somewhat those symbols, but it's hard to know if that's just they're adopting a symbol because Hezbollah is seen as very victorious, or if it's a real penetration of ideas. For the United States, it's been quite interesting because I think the Muslim world is really watching to see if the United States really cares about this pro-democracy movement. And so I think that this is a statement by Secretary Rice where she's saying, to the United States, terrorism is indivisible. So if you're a terrorist in the West Bank and Gaza, it's the same as if you're Al-Qaeda and you're a terrorist that has attacked us, the United States. At the same time, if you read Haniyeh's op-ed in The Guardian, the language that he's using and the language that other people are using as well is, but Hamas is now elected democratically, so don't you have to treat them a little bit differently? So I think it poses this interesting proposition to the United States. I just came back from Southeast Asia where we did a series of research and focus groups, and this is resonating. They're saying things like, how can you be a champion of democracy when you rebuff Hamas? So it is having repercussions outside of just the West Bank and Gaza. Really, Hamas just wants everybody to leave it alone right now. Both sides of this. When you see Khaled Mashal and other people, they talk about, and actually this was also done, they're talking with the recent, again, in response to the Pidge bombing, when they're talking about, you really need to pay attention to Palestinian rights. Everybody talks about Israeli rights, but what about Palestinian rights? These are the 4 rights they mean. Achieving an end to the occupation, Palestinian right of return, removal of Israeli settlements, right to retain weapons. These are the rights, for the most part, that they seem to be talking about. And even though it continues to reiterate this, to the Palestinian people, if you look at what they're really saying that they're trying to focus on internal economic and political reform and set aside the peace process until they can get their own house in order. And in fact, they've offered a ceasefire, not acknowledging Israel's right to exist, but somewhat of a ceasefire until they do that. Also, I think it's important to note, as I was mentioning before, that Hamas has rebuffed criticism by al-Qaeda in the past. So it's walking this somewhat of a tightrope where it's trying, the more radical elements, the true Islamists are putting pressure on it because it's not radical enough, and we're putting pressure on it because it's too radical, and so it's trying to walk that tightrope as much as it possibly can. That's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions you would like at this point.
Thanks, Kim. Let's open it up for comments and questions from the floor. If speakers could please identify themselves and speak up, given the acoustic group. Well, actually, we have microphones we're going to pass around. So, anyone would like to open up? Yes. Question here. I don't know if a microphone's on your way. Why don't you start and just speak up?
I was curious as to...
And identify yourself, please. Thanks.
Ian Tobin, Canadian Embassy. Do you think that Hamas will try to rein in Islamic Jihad in light of recent attacks, or do you think they're just going to let them go, which might, be an attack on their own credibility?
All right, so that's sort of the $60 million question, right? So just my opinion. I would suggest people take a look at the Hudna in 2003, which was an interesting time period where Hamas would enter into the ceasefire, but Pidge and some of the others refused to really enter into the ceasefire. There was a period of sort of backroom negotiations where Hamas was cajoling, working with some other people, trying to cajole everybody to get involved in the ceasefire. Having said that, they never openly criticized any of the groups for not joining the ceasefire. I think that Hamas will continue to walk this tightrope where it knows it's in its best interest for there not to be attacks in West Bank and Gaza, and will probably work its hardest to try and persuade people to not do that. But I don't think you're going to see Hamas Interior Minister rounding up people to arrest them. And I don't think that you're going to see them openly declare that violence is not an option. Because of this right to them to defend themselves, they feel like nobody else will defend them. Nobody in the international community will defend them. So as soon as they give up that right to defend themselves, they have lost all credibility in the eyes of the Palestinian people. And when it comes down to it, that's the community that Hamas really cares about the most, I think. That's just my opinion.
Yes, Paul.
Secretary General Pavlos. I have a question and a quick comment.
Hang on one second. Maybe there's the microphone will reach you, Paul.
The question comes to the fact I was kind of surprised that you consider Al-Qaeda as, in a sense, acknowledges the leadership in any place of the Arab world. I'd never had this kind of impression. I think the Muslim Brotherhood, which is totally different, has a role, but Al-Qaeda has no role. They don't see, the people are not seen on the ground, and so they've really no leadership role, period. And this is the question. As much as the attitude of Hamas, since we had recently a meeting with some of the leadership, I think the points are that there are essentially three questions that they give the following answer. First of all, the question of, as you pointed out correctly, ceasefire. They reiterate they think that ceasefire is possible, and certainly it's their intention to pursue that, irrespective of what's happening recently, but I think this is a state of mind. In terms of the previous commitment that the Palestinian Authority took and Israeli took, they say we are equal. So if the Palestinian Authority is very willing to maintain the commitment that there was, the new Palestinian Authority, of course, that were taken before, if Israel does the same. Third point about recognition of Israel, the situation, I think, in my opinion, is a little bit more fuzzy than what is generally depicted. I think, essentially, they would not say, recognize Israel's right to exist. You are absolutely right. But things are more flexible in the sense that, for instance, approach like the Beirut plan, the Arab plan of 2002, where all Arab states decided that they could recognize Israel if Israel goes back to the 1967 border. This kind of approach is approach which can be worked out. And in fact, their position was, well, we are not against this kind of plan. And the authority, the Palestinian Authority, the new Palestinian Authority, Palestinian leadership can even think of endorsing this kind of plan. So the situation is not clear cut on that, and there is a wide margin of dialogue which is possible. Final point about this idea of democracy. You don't need to go to Indonesia. It's all over present. Everybody in Europe, including, is saying, well, we are promoting democracy, and then they are elected. President Carter goes there, check that elections are done in a fair way, and then after these people are elected, we say we don't want to talk with them. So this is a logical contradiction that, in fact, is perceived all over the Arab world, and not only in the Muslim world, even outside it. Thank you.
It's always interesting when I give this briefing or briefings on Hamas, because sometimes people think I'm too hard on Hamas and sometimes think I'm too soft on Hamas, and I feel like maybe that means I'm probably kind of right down the middle if everybody's a little bit upset with me. I want to talk about something about the Al-Qaeda leadership, or the Al-Qaeda, the impression of Al-Qaeda. I don't want this to be a talk about Al-Qaeda, but it's interesting. I think most people, when they deal with terrorism and counterterrorism, they look at it in that term. So is Al-Qaeda putting itself forward as a leader, and are people recognizing that? And I agree with you, that's not true. That's not happening. The majority of the Muslim world, not just the Arab world, doesn't recognize Al-Qaeda as any sort of leadership in that sense. On the other, yeah. And so, I didn't mean to misconstrue that. On the other hand, you have this interesting phenomenon when you ask people, so what do you think about Osama bin Laden? The response is sort of like, he's a hero, which is interesting, I think. And I'm not saying, they're not saying, oh, I will then go out and take up arms or violence, but I think this is an interesting dilemma. The reason why he's seen as a hero, my understanding of it, is because he's taking on the United States, and nobody else will take us on. And I think that's something that needs to be acknowledged to a certain extent. When it comes to, the recognition of Israel, and I don't want to talk on all of your points, but I do want to talk about this one. It's an interesting dilemma, I think, and I think you're right. It's much more complex than you can even address in this one sort of presentation. But some people think that Hamas will not accept any sort of recognition of Israel and will continue to fight for as long as it exists. And some people say that, well, Hamas might accept the fact that, if they pull back behind the wall, that they'll accept that territory. And what you're saying is somewhat in between that. And the answer is, I'm not sure that we necessarily know. I'm not sure that anybody knows the answer to that question, and I'm not sure we're going to know the answer to the question until something happens. And Hamas makes a decision in that sense.
A number of questions. Yes, ma'am, on the side, and we'll just work around.
My name is Nadia Saad. I'm retired from the World Bank. I'm a student of the Middle East. I was in Cairo and I heard the leader of Hamas say in a very emphatic way, how do you want us to recognize a country when we do not know its frontiers? And he inferred that they would recognize Israel once the frontiers are defined. Did I hear him well, and what would that mean?
Yeah, I think, again, you hear them dance around the issue quite a bit. I don't think that you're going to hear a Hamas leader come out and say, we will recognize Israel on this certain date. It's just not, it can't be part of their agenda, again, because their key audience is the Palestinian community. That's who they're really talking to, and that's who they really care about. Again, as I was saying, I really think it's up in the air right now. Personally, I'm not going to say that. We'll just, just...
Go to Les Simon right there.
Hi, Les Simon, a former scholar here. I'd like to ask you about the reaction and the attitudes of the other Arab leaders in the neighborhood. If this is a dilemma for the United States, it's an even bigger dilemma for the surrounding countries, particularly for Egypt, for Lebanon, one thinks of the Maronites in Lebanon and how they react to this, for Syria, and of course even we see Iran, while it's persecuting Sunnis in Iran, it's announced assistance for Hamas. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about each of those countries and their view of this.
Wow, okay. I mean, you have this interesting, you're absolutely right. It's, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon to a certain extent, Saudi Arabia even. I mean, as soon as Iran said and committed, I think something like 100 million, I can't remember exactly how much. 50. I thought to myself, okay, Saudi Arabia has got to commit something as well, because you have this geopolitical phenomenon that's going on in that area. I'm not sure how different it is. Those leaders have always been fairly supportive of Hamas and the Palestinians, at least at a low, less vocal level, right? So I'm not sure how much of a dilemma it's going to pose to them for their own people, if that's what you're asking me. But I do think it does change the geopolitical dynamics of the Arab Peninsula to a certain extent. And how they treat Hamas and how they move forward is going to be interesting, because you have the United States on the other side. So it's quite interesting.
But the European Union is withholding aid as well. I mean,
and so is Japan and Denmark.
It seems to be. I mean, the question is, the thinking behind that is a squeeze strategy to get to change behavior. And do they have a local option where local Arab states Iran can insulate them from the consequences of holding back that aid, and they can put off making a hard choice?
I mean, to talk about aid, U.S. aid is $400 million. The European Union's aid is something like $600 million. So it's an awful lot of money. The squeeze strategy is interesting. If I just could comment on it, it's a squeeze strategy, except for you notice they have said, we're not going to give money to the Palestinian Authority, but we will continue to give humanitarian aid. Mm-hmm. This is sort of the compromise that has been offered. And so you wonder the degree to which that can be squeezed or not, given that they're still going to be giving humanitarian aid.
Yeah. That gentleman, and then back there, and then we'll come over here.
Howard Moreland, a freelance writer. I've been to Israel and the West Bank twice, once in 1971 and once again last month. And my opinion over this 39-year, or the whole period since the Six-Day War, is that the eastern border of Israel is the Jordan River. I mean, that's what it looks like, and that's in the facts on the ground. And west of the Jordan River, there's only one sovereign power. Everybody uses the same currency. There's one army, one set of ultimate laws. If that's true, and I look at the map and I try to say, how can you make a sovereign country out of this landlocked little piece of land the size of Delaware? It doesn't make any sense to me. To me, it's one country, it's all Israel, and everybody who lives in the West Bank lives in Israel. And a lot of the Palestinians that I talked to last month agreed with me about that. So, but I mean, what do you think about this idea that that there is no possibility of separating the West Bank from Israel?
It's a somewhat different talk, but.
All right. I mean, I think that even if you look at the language coming out of Israel right now, they're this sort of unilateral withdrawal to back behind the wall or the fence or whatever you want to call it. Some places it's the wall, some places it's a fence. is the presupposition for that is that we'll just let the West Bank go its own area and we will maintain our area and our safety on this end of the wall. They haven't gotten there, but that's sort of the presupposition to that sort of action, which is, to me, it is completely giving up on peace. Is we're not sure there can be a peace, so let's protect Israelis on our end and then let the Palestinians worry about the Palestinians. They haven't gotten there yet, but there is a group inside Israel that is articulating that and is arguing that. So, whether it's possible or not, it might happen unilaterally in the near future. And so then you have the problem of, well, is it an international border? How do people cross the border? You have sort of the day-to-day problems of how that gets managed, but it's moving in that direction right now.
Yeah, that gentleman thing.
Clay Swisher from the Middle East Institute. Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni said a few days ago that the position of Israel is that it should distinguish between attacks on civilians done by the Palestinian organizations and attacks on military. Attacks on military targets, the IDF, aren't considered terrorism under the Israeli definition. And I point that out because in your presentation you've said that the first terrorist operation of Hamas was stabbing of IDF soldiers. And I think it's important because if you try to square that with Hamas making efforts to get out of the suicide terrorism business, every Palestinian you talk to, and this was certainly the case in January, and I went there for the elections, and 2 weeks ago when I was there, every Palestinian believes they have a right to resist occupation. And if they're going to evolve, and if we want to push them to get out of the suicide terrorism business, we have to, have this debate on what is legitimate resistance. They're afforded some under international law. Are they allowed to resist settlers who are forcing them from their homes and exacting violence on them? So I wanted to get your thoughts. How do you assess this? I mean, it seems like you consider any act by Hamas as terrorism, and is there any room, do you think, in the international community for them to evolve into getting out of blowing up pizzerias and civilians at shawarma shops?
Right. No, actually, that's fair enough, I think. I think the IDF does do an excellent job in their data of separating attacks against military targets and attacks against civilians. And in fact, you mentioned that I run the RAND terrorism chronology, and we similarly do that. We don't include attacks against military targets anywhere as terrorism, quote unquote. It's what is terrorism, yada, yada, yada. I mentioned those attacks because that's what Hamas leaders say. What were your first militant activities? They say those. And so that's why I did it in my briefing. To ask sort of your more interesting question, which is the big question on everybody's minds, can Hamas moderate? Can you get to a point where maybe Hamas would attack a military like a state would attack a military, but not attack civilians sort of, in that sort of environment? Would they grow up and be state-like rather than terrorist-like? I don't know that I can answer that question. I think that there are forces pushing it both ways right now. There are forces that would make it risky for Hamas to say, okay, you can attack military targets but not civilian targets, and that their credibility stands very much on its ability to challenge Israel. And they can attack military targets, and that's important, a la Hezbollah, but their success is seen as, in the past at least, as hitting civilian targets. At the same time, the people who are the leadership of Hamas, they're very smart, they're highly educated, urban planners, physicians, engineers, and these are people who get good governance and they get strategic thinking, so they could weigh those costs and they could weigh the benefits and they could decide not to do it. But I'm not going to weigh in on which way they're going to go.
Gentleman in the back.
Edward Eagles, to invite you to talk a bit about the decision-making process of the leadership. That's the real question, but a subset. How opaque versus how open is that process? And also, how open is the leadership to research and analysis by outsiders?
You also, just to tag onto that, you distinguished that they held back some of their top leaders from running and participating in government to sort of, and you explained the circumstances for that. Are those outside people, are they part of informal, input into the decision-making process of the government.
Right. To answer both of those questions, just so you know, I'm the one who thinks that they held those off for strategic reasons. Nobody told me that they did that. So that's just sort of
That's a good supposition.
it's my sort of supposition. Yeah.
So I guess I just was wondering, where does it go from there then?
I mean, Hamas is interesting. Look, there's a book that's been written by a former Hamas member on Hamas's internal decision making. There's a lot of work published by academics who are associated with Hamas in the literature about sort of why they made decisions. Hamas leaders, there are a lot of interviews with them that are published both in Arabic and in English. And Hamas issues leaflets like you would not believe, justifying their activities, why they do X, why they do Y. Whether you believe whether you believe them in the interviews, whether you believe the leaflets, at least that gives some transparency into their thinking from my point of view, to answer that question. And yes, Hamas immediately after the recent elections reached out to academics, known associates of Hamas and non-known associates of Hamas. They've reached out to civil society representatives to try and get people's views of how they should be governing and what they should be doing. It's a fairly small community, so in that sense they do that. As a historian, I think they have made mistakes in their strategic decision making. You can point them out. For example, the suicide bombings when I was there in '96 were a strategic mistake, and they lost a lot of support in the Palestinian community. And if you look at Shikaki's polls, opinion polls from that time period, you can see a drop in support for the Palestinians, for Hamas amongst the Palestinians because of the suicide bombings. So they have made strategic decisions and made mistakes in those strategic decisions in the past. But what's interesting is it's a learning organization. And so I think you can see that as it has evolved over time.
Yes, in the back. Yes.
Melissa Maley with Sino Resources. You talked a little bit about the '94 Palestinian violence. And when you talk to Palestinian security officials about that period and how they were going to deal with the Hamas threat, so to speak, they would often cite that '94 to '96 experience as being where they didn't want to go. They didn't want it to provoke that kind of fighting within their own community, and therefore you would often hear a response was, well, Hamas is too strong and so we can't do X, Y, or Z. Now, more recently we have seen violence, Palestinian violence, and you've seen Hamas foot soldiers take on policemen in various settings, but then you've seen them pull back from that brink. What is the view of Hamas leadership now towards Palestinian violence? You have a specter of Fatah renegades or rebels, whatever you want to call them. They're actively trying to undermine their leadership and their ability to govern. Have they evolved in their perception of how they're going to manage Palestinian conflict, or kind of where are they right now?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I mean, it's true the Palestinian Authority has arrested Hamas members. They do prior to the January elections when Hamas was leadership of the Palestinian Authority, when you for example, in '96, after those suicide bombings I told you about, you see a roundup of a lot of different Hamas members. It has happened in the past. Even in those circumstances, Hamas leadership has always said, we do not condone Palestinian on Palestinian violence. Having said that, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the people who mentioned who they were just there, I mean, I wasn't there in the 70s, so I don't know what it was like, but I've been there frequently for the last 10 years, and, it's chaotic. It was chaotic. It's less so now, but sort of right in the heat of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, people who were quote-unquote collaborators, and you've heard this term, were being assassinated a lot, and you weren't quite sure for what reason. So I think sort of my point is the Al-Aqsa Intifada had devolved the security situation and eroded it to a very, very large degree. And what you're seeing now are remnants of that. It's my hope that Hamas and the rest of the Palestinian Authority will come to some sort of agreement and closure so that you don't have this continued violence. But I don't think it's an issue of Hamas leadership evolving. They've always been that way. They've always said there shouldn't be Palestinian fighting. They've just been reacting to this situation in the Al-Aqsa Intifada that's been quite bad in that area.
I think there's questions up here in this part of the room. Yeah, start with the woman there. Yes.
Hi, Leah Odenek, APAC. I actually have a question about the leadership structure, which was sort of asked before, but you didn't really get into it. The whole issue of the outside leadership and the inside leadership. With elections, Khaled Mashal's has come out making statements. He's certainly lobbying on behalf of the Palestinians, but he's not officially part of that government. Do you see any sort of split taking place in terms of the power structure and who's the head of Hamas now? What are you seeing in terms of how is it working?
Okay, all right. Problem is, it's only been 3 or 4 months, so it's really hard to see what's going on. I think the important thing to note about Hamas is when you see people talk about terrorism, they frequently talk about military wing, political wing, and they say there's real differences of opinion. Hamas really has not been that way. And actually, if you look at their posters from the elections, they have a specific sign. I brought them, but I had to take them off because my file was too big. But they have a specific sign for the militant group, which is a minor change to the political wing, which was a minor change to the group that ran for office. So they're not even saying, oh, we have a political branch, militant branch. We are Hamas, and they present that image forward. So I think that's important, I think. I would take what Khaled Mashal says as Hamas leadership statements. Now, having said that, internal to Hamas, as I was saying before, there have been debates, and we know there have been debates going on. Haniyeh, who's the one who's out there talking now, was a part of the more moderate camp of that debate in the mid-1990s. So is there a debate going on right now inside Hamas? Probably. I think that's probably true. This isn't a dictatorship type group. It's a group where there are debates within it, which is why part of the reason why I didn't answer that question is I think there's a debate going on right now, and we don't necessarily know the answer to that.
Some additional questions down at this end.
My name is Stephen Short. To ask a variant of a question previously asked, is there any debate between Israeli targets, whether civilian or military, east of the 67 border and west of it? Any possibility that Hamas may, at some stage, discipline those of its members that attack west of the 67 border?
Just pass it to the next gentleman.
Okay.
Just hold on until she answers that question.
Oh, okay. I thought we were going to take two questions. All right. Recently, you have seen some rhetoric about the 67 border, and that being the point rather than the sea. So perhaps they would discipline people that way, back and forth. Hamas, I don't know, several months ago, there were a bunch of journalists and NGO leaders who were kidnapped in Gaza, and then they were released. Most people seem to think that there was a negotiation that took place that the people who did the kidnapping were sort of rebuked and saying, no, you're not supposed to kidnap Western journalists and Western NGOs. That's crossing the line. So maybe there has been some discipline, in that sense in the past. But the whole 67 border, as was discussed before, is still very much the 67 border. If you guys should look at the security fence and the wall. That's really the border we should be talking about to a certain extent, because that's really the reality on the ground, I think.
Yes. And then Tom Hirschfeld. Go ahead, sir.
I'm Matt Seidman with the Navy. I have two questions for you, and both deal with Hamas, the future. The first question is, what do you see the interaction between Egypt and Hamas and Gaza leading to as far as the relationship between Hamas and Egypt? And the second question is, based on history, it's probably likely that the Arab countries will support Palestinians with money for a month or two. So what's going to be the impact on Hamas when that money dries out?
Tom, go ahead and you can go ahead and answer that, and Tom Hirschfeld's next. You're next, Tom. Hang on. Just let her answer that question.
I was wondering, really, it was a sort of like your your question, would you speculate on, given the previous record of Arab governments in being supportive of the Palestinians financially, to what extent do you think that the present effort is going to be any more effective than previously? And it's essentially, I'm asking you to speculate about how the squeeze is going to come out if the Arab financing doesn't work. The second question is Resolution 242. Has Hamas made any mention of that? Does that play any kind of a role at all? Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, the squeeze and the money running out. I think Hamas is going to. I mean, it's pretty well given that Hamas is going to really hurt. I mean, it's going to hurt Hamas. It's going to hurt the Palestinians. It's going to hurt everybody involved. The thing about that is particularly interesting right now is Hamas is sort of, even though it would probably prefer the money to come in, if it implodes, it can blame the United States right now. The United States, European Union, Japan, whoever else you want to. But really, it can say, it didn't work out. It's not our fault. We weren't incompetent. It was the United States pressure, right? If it fails the way things are going right now with the squeeze, it has. And what is the Palestinian people's response to that going to be? Our current policy, or the policy of the global community's assumption, is the Palestinian people will then turn towards a group like Fatah and moderate. There's a possibility that the Palestinian people will turn towards a group more radical. I think that's important to keep in the back of our minds when you're asking what will happen to Hamas and what will happen to the response. I'm not sure I could weight either one, but we're sort of betting on one side, and we need to keep in our mind the possibility that it could go the other way. The UN resolutions are brought up as a rhetorical device. I think the United States, why doesn't the international community hold up these UN resolutions? And that's sort of to briefly answer that question. With the interaction between Egypt and Gaza, it's actually an interesting relationship because Egypt would really prefer that they not come into Egypt, and there's a lot of weapons trafficking that goes across that border in that sort of sense. So, I mean, I would expect that Egypt, in the back of their minds, is somewhat nervous about that situation themselves. To answer that question, yeah, I think that's probably true.
I had a question, this gentleman here.
Hi, Alan Brown from the Canadian Embassy. You talked a little bit about the implications of Hamas victory for Al-Qaeda and for the United States, but you didn't speak too much until just now about the implication for Fatah and Fatah's reaction to the victory and the prospect of any kind of reform arising within the Fatah movement as a result of the victory. Could you look a little bit ahead and tell me what the influence of the victory has been on Fatah?
Sure. I'm not a Fatah expert. I would say that even prior to the elections, you had, well, everybody knows this, but prior to the elections, you had this interesting cleavage that was going on. Part of it was generational, where you had sort of the new up-and-comers saying, look, we've got to deal with this corruption internally. Part of it was generational, so you had people who wanted to deal with the corruption internally moderately and reform-wise, and then you had this militant wing also evolving, inside of the Fatah branch, which is what was talked about a little bit earlier. And a lot of people say it's not that Hamas won, it's that Fatah lost. They didn't get their act together in the campaign. And as a result, Hamas was able to eke in. I think it's probably a combination of both. I don't think you can look at the history of Hamas building its credibility and say, I think there was probably a combination of both. There's definitely some internal reflection going on in Fatah now because you can see it in what they're saying. They haven't joined the Hamas. Hamas has offered a coalition government. Fatah has decided it's better off to not join that. That maybe Hamas will implode and they will be the next best alternative. I think that's sort of the calculation that they're making. Whether true reform is happening inside Fatah or not is it's going to be a little bit hard to tell. Again, because it's only been a few months, so it's hard to say.
I have one last question here, and then we'll wrap up the session.
Olivia Stone, Middle East Institute. You talked a lot about how Hamas kind of seeks to legitimize its violent acts in its leaflets and things like that. I was wondering if Hamas has ever made any reference to the Irgun and to Zionist underground terrorist organizations, or some characterize them as underground terrorist organizations, in its leaflets as kind of historical precedent of the use of violence in a nationalist struggle. I don't know, it's just an interesting kind of longer historical view of the entire kind of conflict, and I just was wondering whether they've ever made reference to Irgun or the King David Hotel bombings.
Yeah, sure. Not that I've seen. If they make reference to historical conflict, you know, it's back to the Prophet and back to the struggle that was going on there. I'm not sure. I have to say I haven't seen every single leaflet. I've seen about 200. So, you know, you could go back and look at all the others. I don't know. Sorry.
I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please join me in thanking Kim Cragin for an excellent presentation.
Okay, be there in a second. It's like very, like, I feel like it's just very interesting research. But like, like a scholar. Yeah, it's not. It actually doesn't express it.